Hi, everyone, and a warm welcome to you all. Thanks for joining us tonight for the Fall 2020 Design Lecture Series. I'm Helen Maria Nugent, and I'm the Dean of Design at California College of the Arts and a faculty member in the MFA Design program. First, a little bit about CCA. The Division of Design hosts 6 undergraduate programs and 3 graduate programs in fashion design, furniture design, graphic, illustration, industrial design, and interaction design. And at the graduate level, we have an interdisciplinary MFA that weaves graphic design, ID, and IXD, a low residency MBA in design strategy, and a 1-year intensive MDes in interaction design. Design at CCA is a sanctuary for those with radical curiosity, where wonder and imagination are amplified through rigor and craft. We equip makers, thinkers, and doers with the wherewithal to envision alternative futures and the creative capacity to deliver generative solutions and inspire change. In partnership with our colleagues across fine arts, architecture, and the humanities, our collective purpose is to make art and design that matters. Our campuses are located in Huichin and Yelamu, also known as Oakland and San Francisco, respectively, on the unceded territories of the Chochenyo and Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, who have continuously lived upon this land since time immemorial. We recognize the historic discrimination and violence inflicted upon Indigenous peoples in California and the Americas, including their forced removal from ancestral lands and the deliberate and systematic destruction of their communities and cultures. CCA honours Indigenous peoples past, present and future here and around the world, and we wish to pay respect to our local elders. The Fall 2020 Lecture Series will be presented entirely online, which is why we're all here right now on Zoom. It's free, open to the CCA community and everyone around the globe. Just RSVP for the Zoom invite. As you can see, we are on lecture number 4 of our 8 lecture series. Our esteemed guests are leading designers, strategists, curators, and educators. They'll be addressing how we use design as a tool of empowerment to define and overcome the most pressing issues of our time, including racial inequality, environmental catastrophe, and inhumane technological changes. I invite you to join us for all of these critical conversations where you'll be learning about inclusive design, ethical AI, practicing with integrity, sustainable fashion, community enrichment, Afrofuturism, speculative fiction, which you'll hear about tonight, and design for social, economic, and cultural change. I want to give a quick shout out to Juan Pablo Raal, a recent alumni of the MFA in Design program, for creating all of our branding materials and the visual materials for the 2020 lecture series. You can read more about his approach to this commission on and his goal of creating a decolonized expression of design and a woven form to represent the interconnectedness of the different events that we're hosting this semester. And a shout out to all the staff in the background tonight who are helping put this series together. Thank you so much. Our next event is on Tuesday, October 27th, next week, when we'll have Dominic Rickford discussing fashion, race, and sustainability with an introduction by Rebecca Burgess of Fibershed. The event is hosted and supported by the fashion program and also by Fibershed. So before I move on to a quick introduction to our chair of furniture, I want to show you how we're going to host the event this evening. So you will see at the bottom of your screen a Q&A button. Please use this to ask questions. You can ask questions all the way through the lecture tonight. If there's a question that you really like, please upvote it. And at the end of Folayemi's presentation, we will ask the questions that have the most upvotes. So please be sure to use that. The chat will be disabled until near the end of the presentation, and then we'll open that up again. And you can also say hi and thank you and other things. But if you have a question, please use the Q&A feature. So could Kathy and Folayemi turn their videos on, please? Hi.
Hello.
So I'm not alone here in the space. Tonight we're going to be hearing from Folayemi Wilson. I am really excited about this since I have followed her practice since I was living in Chicago, which is where she is now. And I'm super eager, especially to hear about her approach to speculative fiction, which is what I'm currently teaching and what my design students are all here watching tonight, hoping to learn about Folayemi's approach. But first, let me introduce Catherine Lamb, who you see now. She is the chair of the BFA in Furniture program. Kathy is an independent designer and builder with a practice that spans over 20 years of engagement, ranging from production furniture to handmade objects and land-based works in the high desert of New Mexico. So a big range of things. And Kathy is also an alumnus of our CCA program here, so it's really incredible. And she's going to give you an introduction to our guest speaker tonight. Thank you so much for joining us, and I am excited for your talk.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen Maria. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. This is the Furniture program's first lecture this academic year. We're very excited that you've joined us. The Furniture program is an undergraduate making-based program in the design division located on the San Francisco campus. Our program exists at the intersection of design, art, and craft. And this year's lecture series is focused on presenting diverse practices that center furniture and object making. So we're really excited to welcome Folayemi Wilson tonight. Among her many accomplishments, Fo earned an MFA in furniture from RISD with a concentration in art history, theory, and criticism, and also holds an MBA from New York University's Stern School of Business, and is currently a professor at Columbia College in Chicago. Folayemi and I have had some really interesting discussions in the last couple of weeks and months, and I'm really excited for us all to hear more about her work tonight and with the Q&A. So Folayemi, please take it away.
Thank you, Catherine. As you said, we definitely have been talking for over a year, I think. So I'm really happy to come and be here. And thank you, Helen Marie, for welcoming me also. We definitely miss you here in Chicago. So I wanted to acknowledge that Chicago is on the land of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and the Odawa, and about a dozen other tribal nations. Tonight, I thought what I would do is talk about my context for radical making. And Catherine and I had been talking, and she posed some specific questions to me. So I'm going to answer some of those questions in the context of my work. And I'll use 3 projects. I'm going to focus on 3 projects to do that. And okay, so I think I'm ready to share my screen. And there we go. Okay, and view full screen. Okay, and play. Okay, so I hope everybody can see that. Catherine, you can let me know if there's a problem. So I'm just going to start, like, what does it mean to be a radical maker? In one of my signatures in my website, I have this quote by James Baldwin. It says, "Artists are here to disturb the peace." And certainly with the murder of Black bodies that has continued over many centuries, the failure of capitalism to provide equitable distribution of wealth, the unabashed white supremacy and injustice that's showing its face, certainly the political realm has emerged with quite a bit of vigor. And for, I think, a lot of white folks, with the pandemic and what has happened with George Floyd and others, that there's been this great reveal about inequity. But I think for people of color, for LGBTQ community plus Q communities, for differently bodied communities, this is not new news at all. And this is just revealing what we've all lived with and what we've all known. Many people say that the personal is political. And in my referencing to radical making, I kind of want to turn that around and make the personal very political. So what I want to imagine or talk about more is what it looks like after dismantling systematic power and privilege, and what does it feel like to be liberated. And in a way, I feel like I actually am liberated, but the world is not liberated. So there's this tension between my own personal reality when I wake up in the morning and do my meditation to what's out there in the world and how the world sees me and deals with me. So I want to take more of a look at what freedom looks like. And so I'm thinking that in the context of how I feel in relationship to the world, that what's really radical is this idea of my freedom. That's what's not really there. And that's what I'm thinking of as being in a radical space. So one of the things I started thinking about was, what are the foundations of consciousness for a radical maker and some of the conditions that make radical making possible in the space of freedom? So I'm hoping that you guys in the audience are going to think about what your answers are, because I'd love to discuss them to you. And these are some preliminary things that I've thought of that I think are important to me. Being true to oneself, to make your work and no one else's. And that sounds like this kind of altruistic thing, but think about it. It's really hard to make your own work that's not influenced by your parents, your friends, the art and design market, your teachers, what sells, what doesn't sell, who's done something before. To make work that only you can make and that no one else can make, I think is pretty radical. And to be in the frame of mind and have the confidence to do that is also pretty radical to me. In terms of conditions, I'd love to see in the world that the impulse to possess, which I think is a colonizing principle, transforms itself into generosity, which I feel speaks to collectivity. The absence of mechanisms of control, gatekeeping, surveillance, and appropriation. Think about it. You take away all that stuff. I hope you guys are nodding in the audience, even though I can't see you. You take away mechanisms of control, gatekeeping, ideas of surveillance and appropriation. And I think that there's some space there that's opening up. You've got some freedom. In terms of the work that needs to be done, we need to create systems of equity that offer safe spaces for all bodies, for all people. That means doing away with norms. Beauty that is not marketed but shared could be alternatives to capitalism, where there aren't these ideas of standards. So in terms of language, kind of getting rid of this idea of what the average is, the mean, what is normal, what is standard, or what is typical, that all expressions of self are okay, and that there isn't this idea of what normal is, because everything is all right. So a little bit of an introduction to how I'm looking at what radical making is about. And one of the first questions that Catherine asked me is, why furniture? Why did I turn to furniture? I have a background in graphic design. I had a studio and an office both in New York and the Bay Area, where you guys are. And at a certain point, I had renovated a loft that I worked and lived in New York, where I lived. That's where I'm from. And an architect friend who was working with me, we designed a lot of the furniture together. She said, you should consider doing more of this. I'm like, okay. So when I was out in California, I took some classes at UC Berkeley and really just could stay in the studio all day. And after got my son through college, I was like, I can do something different. So I decided to study furniture. I'm a self-taught graphic designer. So I wanted to study differently, which is why I enrolled in the program at RISD. So in terms of how I chose furniture, so you're seeing a picture of Sapelli Forest. a Shango dance staff, and some of my favorite tools. I love to use the sustainable wood that you can get from South America. I love to work with sapelli. It's nice and soft like mahogany, but can be grown in sustainable forests. I'm very connected to trees. I would say that as a child, my first friend was a tree. As a young child, I would go sit in this tree in our yard all the time and talk to it. In West African cosmology, Shango is a deity of war, and he has an axe that he yields, or a machete, and he is definitely for justice, and his material is wood. The two tools on my right, on your right, the small hammer and the little plane, they're really, really cheap tools, like a few dollars, but they're my favorite. In fact, my partner in my design studio, Norman, when I brought that small hammer to do some work, he was making fun of me because it's really small, but it's really mighty, and you can hold it in your hand really well. And that little plane, I love to do finishing with, because you can get into places you can't get with a big plane and make some corrections. So why furniture? I love making. When I started in graphic design, the computer, now you know how old I am, the computer in the 80s came late in the 80s. And when I first trained as a young design professional, hand skills were involved in design. Like, I learned how to make rules with a ruling pen. The smell of stats, people don't know what that is anymore. You had to draw type when you're doing comps. Those kinds of things, I really, really love doing those hand skills. So furniture just felt really comfortable to do, and I privileged the hand in making. So one of the questions Catherine asked was, are there specific value systems embedded in craft as an activity and a practice? So I want to use a project, a visual art project, Dark Matter, Celestial Objects as Messengers of Love in These Troubled Times. And this solo show was last year in the spring and the summer at the Hyde Park Art Center. And this would be a great example of speculative fiction used as narrative and Afrofuturism. So the genesis of this work, or one of the inspirations from this work, is Voyager 1 and 2 and the Golden Record. If I were looking at you, we were in an audience, I'd ask if some of you knew about the Golden Record. It was attached to Voyager 1 and 2 and sent into space about 1977. It's about 13 billion light years away or something right now. And the record was a project of Carl Sagan, and they included on this record 150 encoded images, greetings in 55 languages from around the world. And the idea was send it out in space, and hopefully other celestial beings would be able to find the record, figure out how to play it, and receive it as a benevolent message from Earth. So that was very much an inspiration for this show that I was doing at the Hyde Park Art Center called Dark Matter. So I want to give you a sense of what the gallery usually looks like. It's a very large 2,400 square foot gallery with white walls. Up at the top, you're seeing a mezzanine that's a video mezzanine that can be used to show video. It's got gray cement floors. We transformed it into a very space-like space, painted the walls black, used bags and bags of glitter and hand-cut mylar to put on the walls. We painted the floor blue, and you can see this is what the walls look like with light, and this is what the walls look like in the dark space that we created in there. Let me go back. What you're seeing here are these ceramic orbs that I created at a residency at the Kohler factory in Wisconsin. when I was there, and learned a lot about how to do that. Just to give you scale, this is a sculpture that's designed as a fictional spaceship coming from space, referenced from the architectural profiles of shotgun houses. You can see here Andy, one of the preparators, helping to install, and you can see in the picture on the right, we had to build the sculpture in the space of the gallery because we couldn't get it in otherwise. So that's the sculpture there. It's called Zora. I imagine that it's part of a spinning spaceship that comes through the gallery ceiling and lands and bringing these orbs into the space. The orbs are on lava rock. And the space includes video from an archive from the NASA's archive that I manipulated. So in the video gallery that's up here, these are videos that are of the moon and the sun that are constantly on a loop. And then within the space, there are 3 soundscapes created by a frequent collaborator I work with, Joelle Mercedes. And I'm just gonna play a little bit. So these soundscapes are in different places all around the gallery space to create a very sensory experience. Imagine that the video is playing, it's very dark, your eyes have to take time to adjust. There's sounds, so you feel like you come in and you're in another world. Just to give you more scale, that's folks walking on the mezzanine there. And this is how it looks on the mezzanine from there. And this is a low res version of what the video of the sun would feel like if you're in the space. It also projects on the outside. So when you're walking down the street in the Hyde Park area, the videos would be going there too. So the idea was that this was a place of healing, reflection, and an offering to the community to come in to reflect during these times, which are very troubled. There were pillows outside. You could sit in and meditate and be quiet and come into the space. And it was very interesting because a lot of the people of color that came into the space would say when they came in, they immediately would take a breath and they felt like they could breathe, like it felt like it was welcoming to them. And that's what it was meant to be. So this idea of time is one of the ways I define Afrofuturism. I think of it as a traditional kind of African philosophical way of thinking about time that's simultaneous, where the past, present, and future is very much collapsed into one experience. One of the wonderful things that I got to do was to invite Krista Franklin, who is a poet, a writer, and a visual artist, to have her respond to the work by creating a poem. I commissioned a poem that she did, and then asked her to perform it with Ben Lamar Gay, who is a musician, a wonderful experimental musician. So we recorded it with an audience live in the space, and created an LP for the catalog. So there was Ben and there was Krista reciting the poem, and it was really wonderful. And I'm really, really proud of this product from the exhibition. It's available through Candor Arts. It was made in an edition of 200. It has a booklet with essays about the exhibition and all the components of the exhibition. And then it has a 12-inch LP, which is a recording of Krista's poem, and it has a copy of the poem and also an art print that's inside. We were producing it afterwards in the winter and got shut down during COVID, and were able to get back into production. So it just became available about a month ago. So what are the other questions? What does technology look like in my version of the future? I want to look at a curatorial project that's about 10 years old, but I still feel it's very relevant for today. It's called The New Materiality, Digital Dialogues at the Boundaries of Contemporary Craft. It traveled to 4 venues. It included one of your own, Donald Fortescue, that was part of this. I'll show you some of the work in there. It traveled from the Fuller Craft Museum, where it originated, to the Milwaukee Art Museum, to the Asheville Museum, and to the Arkansas Arts Center. This is Donald's piece that he did in collaboration with Lawrence LaBianca. They made a very traditional table that they put out of steel, that they put rocks and other kinds of things in, submerged it into the ocean, and then recorded the sound that that table heard while it was there. They created, this is a very large piece, about 10 feet high, with polycarbonate laser cut pieces and zip ties. They created like a wailing horn, so that when you encounter the piece, you not only encounter the object, but you encounter the sound that the object heard when it was submerged into the ocean. There are about 16 artists in this show. That represent textiles, glass, furniture, jewelry, and other kinds of making. This is a work by Leah Cook called Face Masks Revisioned Lips. She does these very intimate portraits of her family and then produces them on a jacquard hand loom. This is a piece by a former student, Sean Bullens. Again, a very traditional representation of furniture, but you see that the 2 screens up top are videos of a bird, and the bird actually flies around in the cage, and then it sees and it looks to the other branch, and it sees it can escape, and it flies over in the video and the digital representation of it to the branch where it is free. Basketry by Natalie Miebach, who takes digital data from weather patterns and creates sculptures out of them that, if you understood her logic, you could read the sculpture for the data, but it also serves as a beautiful object and sculpture. The 3D chair by Brian Bolden looks like there's a physical chair inside the glass sculpture, but it's actually decals that are positioned in a way to look like, if you turn around the object, that you could see a moving chair. A piece by Sonia Clark is made of combs. She kept the positive parts of the comb, removed negative parts to make this portrait of Madam C.J. Walker, who in the early 20th century became America's first female millionaire by creating hair products. So the connection of hair with wealth, with combs, is in this very large physical tapestry. And then the last example I'm going to show you is from a Stolen Jewels series that Mike and Makey, a design studio in your area, I don't know if they're still there, but she gathered images from Google of famous iconic pieces of jewelry, like the Hope Diamond, and reproduced very bitmap digital images on printed and scored leather. So there's 6 examples of the series that they did, and they're very wearable facsimiles of the pieces. So I'm going to move on to my last project that I want to talk about, with the question, can design as a practice reconcile itself with colonialism and capitalism? And I think that the answer is no. We have to start all over. I think the famous lesbian feminist Audre Lorde in 1979 said her famous dictum, "We can't dismantle the master's house with the master's tools," right? So I think we kind of have to start all over again. And I think mining older, more ancient cultures, that a lot of the answers about how we might rebuild our communities and culture are there to mine and to look at and to think about in terms of bringing into the present. So this last project I'm going to talk about is the Commons Artist Project called the Commons Table, and it's part of a design project I did with my studio, BlkHaUS Studios, which is a collaboration between myself and my design partner, Norman Teague. This was at the Museum of Contemporary Art from November 12th to March of this year. And it's kind of an example of struggling with assumptions and geographies of power and where power actually sits. The idea of the show, well, first I want to say that this common space is a new space that the MCA created. When you come up to the official entrance, you can come into the space for free. You don't have to pay, so you can come at any time. And it was meant to be a welcoming space where performance, talks, and other things happen. And what they started doing was inviting artists and designers to take over the space for 5 and 6 months and create programs that brought communities in. Our project was called the Commons Table as part of this Commons Artist Project. And this project was fairly complex in that it had 6 components, 5 discussion themes, 5, I need to move this over, 5 off-site convenings in 5 different neighborhoods in Chicago, 4 on-site exhibitions, 1 archive, and 1 final report. So these dinners we thought was a way to bring community together. We started experimenting in our studio. We ended up creating 5 different themes and having 5 different dinners in different neighborhoods. The themes were commodification of modernism, nature and social justice in 21st century cities, disability and perspective, radical futures, which we did with teens, and then relationships between collectors and artists. What we would do is we would invite, for each of these dinners and conversations, we would invite a community member to lead the conversation who had some stake in the theme. We would invite another person at that dinner to curate an exhibition that would happen actually at the museum from objects that people brought. So this was around the idea of collecting, and we wanted to push against the institution and the museum to challenge them to think about including the collection strategies of the communities that they sit in and how that may affect how they collect themselves. We actually made some pedal tables that were able to come apart that we could take on location and bring with us to some of the dinners. And we asked folks to bring objects that related to what we were talking about. We had a kiosk at these locations. We took portraits of them with their objects, and we collected stories about their objects. This particular set of 10 folks that participated in the conversation around the commodification of modernism. These were some of the objects that they brought with them. And then these are some of the portraits that we took of them. And so we designed these stands. This area of the, we found out this area of the space in the museum did not have insurance. So we just wanted to have the objects out on tables so people could touch and feel them. And they were like, no, we can't quite do that. But so we designed these places, these stands for them to go in. And we displayed these objects with a quote from the person that brought it. We displayed their portraits with some information about the theme. The curator who selected the objects would write a bit about how they selected it and what they wanted to share about our conversation with visitors about the different themes. And then at the end, we presented our findings from each of the dinners we had. And at each of the dinners, we asked what would participants want museums to know about what they feel about communities and collecting. And so we reported a lot on that. So I'm going to just play about a 90-second little promotion.
Everybody collects, whether they even realize not, whether it's dishes, whether it's socks. Objects are imbued with the giver, the taker, the owner.
I think that the base is adding on to these like lineages of practices by Black women and Black makers.
I was realizing that there was a moment when that world got bigger, the discovery that the world wasn't all me.
Historically, I think about how I'm connected through other cultures.
These objects flesh out a life that you would never know. And many of us find secrets after they die. I really like that particular piece because it looks like a little sculpture, almost like a little person.
When you collect, you're becoming the author of your own story.
It's a big connection, you know, and as human beings, that's all we want to do is connect.
I think it's like super important to just always have a reflection of yourself. That's what I really want my daughter to remember.
If you see something you really like, something's going to happen in your body. We call it the catch, and it goes like this.
So one of the other questions, the last question that Catherine asked me is, what is the role of the maker in shaping inclusive futures? And I would love to hear what some of you all think about that question. But I think to be a radical maker kind of goes back to some of the things that I started with in terms of being oneself, making the work that only you can make, which I think is really, really, really hard, and it takes a lifetime. I think of the imagination as a technology that we can all use. I mean, I think of the fact that I would not be here if it wasn't for the imagination of my ancestors through all the hardships they went through to imagine that I could be freer than them and that I could be here. And I have the privilege and the luxury to be a maker, to be an educator, to be an artist, to be a designer. If someone before me had not imagined that I could do that or wanted that for me, I would not be here. So I feel like it's my responsibility to take that baton and imagine further what freedom can look like for people who make, people who want to make, people who are creative and inventive. And I think making in the context of respecting our planet and wanting to have equity so that all voices are heard, moving from the vertical of hierarchy to the horizontal of equity that's what the maker can do in terms of also bringing beauty into the world. I think beauty is underrated, particularly now when we're restricted with COVID and we're dealing with all we're dealing with in our political landscape. Don't you appreciate the little things, the little moments of joy in your life or beauty that you get to see, like I get to see, like when I'm walking my dog and all the beautiful colors of the trees that are changing? Those little things I really appreciate. If I can bring some of that beauty into my work to give pleasure or joy to others, I feel like that I'm doing something valuable. And if I can create the space and encourage my students to do their best work, to try to overcome whatever obstacles they can, and if I can provide a safe space for them to do that, then I think I'm doing pretty good. So I'd like to say thank you so much for inviting me to talk with you. It's a little weird not being able to see you all, but I hope that we can engage in a bit of conversation about some of the things that I've talked about tonight. And let me unshare my screen. Okay, all right. All righty, I hope I'm still with you. Nope.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to see all of your work in a run, and to hear you talk about it. In our conversations, we've talked about a lot of different things. I think you and I had actually our first Zoom call around May, end of May. It was an interesting time. So it's really wonderful to see all the work and hear you speak more about the projects.
Oh, thank you. And I went broad and not deep, so I'm open to any kind of questions about these projects.
Great. Well, it looks like we have one from Donald Fortescue. I'm just going to read it as if I'm Donald. Fo, thank you for joining us here at CCA and for sharing your projects and perspective with us. I would like to hear more about your provocation that design cannot extricate itself from capitalism or colonialization. Designers see themselves as creators or conduits for value. Are there ways that this activity can be valued that aren't immediately co-opted and commodified through retail outlets, galleries, museums, or professional systems?
That's a big question. Thank you, Donald. I think what I'm saying is that I want to do away with that system. So like, let's talk about academia, right? Okay, so academia has this system that's set up on a hierarchy, right? And so like where I teach, we are trying to dismantle the system. And I feel like it's an endless game inside the system and it doesn't work. So when people talk about diversity and inclusion, what I believe they're saying is they want to diversify the racist structure that we have. They want to include more people of color in the racist structure that we have. I don't want to do that. I want to create new structures that are different. I would like to create a new university, culture or system, and create different ways of exchange that is more fair, that might be some combination of a social capitalist kind of thing where people can still have the independence to do the kind of business they want to do, but it's instead of shareholder value in terms of money and stock, maybe that value gets redefined as what is the value of that business to the community it sits in. And maybe we have different measures to measuring value in that kind of way. So without taking too much time, I think going in that direction is what I'm talking about.
So really it's a reevaluation of the structures and the systems themselves, not just what might feel like patches in terms of finding us, in terms of solutions, just plugging people in here and there.
Right.
You're talking about a bigger overhaul of how we view things and how our value systems need an overhaul.
Exactly, like take the gallery system that some designers participate in. So a young up and coming talented designer, let's say they sell a piece for $10,000 in a gallery. Well, the gallery's taken 40, 60% of that. If they want to get the $10,000 for it, they're going to have to price it a lot higher. What does that do? That means the people that can buy it become smaller and smaller. And then what happens 20 years later if that designer works pretty hard and is successful and if that piece goes to auction for $150,000? Does the artist see that? No. The person who owned it gets to benefit from all the hard work that the artist has done to increase the value of the piece. and it's the person who bought it. Now, if that person happened to be someone that was investing in that artist, great. But if that person just bought it as a commodity to have in their home to say, look, gee, I got a piece by so-and-so, I don't think they deserve to have the benefit of the wealth and the hard work of that artist over time. The artist should be able to reap that. And I think that very enterprising designers and artists are starting to put those kinds of things in their contract, that artists can't give away. I mean, collectors can't give away their work to any museum. It's like, if you want to give it away, here are the museums you're able to give it away to. You can't just give it anywhere. So I think those are the ways to bring power back to the maker and try to be more fair and equitable.
So because we are in an educational sphere, do you see the education of artists and designers as perhaps needing to include? I mean, you have an MBA, right? You've studied business in a real
irony of that, right?
But I can't help but think that that offers you some sort of a certain kind of perspective on the relationship between these structures we're talking about that might need some disassembling and creative practice.
Yeah, you know, when I decided to go to business school, I was trying to decide between a traditional business school program, and there's a program at Pratt that is modeled more for designers specifically. And I looked at that program, and I went to NYU, and I thought, you know, I really want to understand the world of the masters of the universe. I really want to know what I'm getting into if I'm going to take my practice in a particular direction. So those skills I haven't necessarily used them to become a rich financier, because making is really important to me, but they do come in handy in terms of understanding the language of business in a way that gives me a certain perspective, that I can see things a little clearer when I'm encountering folks that are really squarely in that camp of a capitalist camp. I can understand the system a little better. So it does become helpful. But afterwards, I did not want to work for Anderson Consulting or McKinsey, although I did have McKinsey as a client.
I'm gonna, on the topic of education, I'm gonna throw in a question from Helen Maria here. Are there current examples of alternative educational groups that you are inspired by?
Yes, very much so. I don't know if you guys know about Design as Protest group. That's a killer group of young designers that have come together in community to really take action to make designers of color much more visible and putting them at the seat of the table. And there's a subset of that called Dark Matter University, no relationship to my project. And that's a group of academics, designers around the country that are getting together and pulling together curriculum that they can offer students of color. So what the situation is that in most design schools, if there are any educators and professors of color, there's like one in this department, one in that department. There's not a critical mass. So it's very hard for students of color who want to study design to be in spaces where there's a critical mass of people of color that are teaching design from a more global and equitable perspective. So this group of people has gotten together to offer classes. I can't tell you all the plans, but they started to offer classes to certain institutions from professors of color that are at different institutions around the country. So I think that's a great model. And I'm just so proud of this group of just saying, hey, we're just going to do it. we don't quite, we're just going to do it. We're going to make it happen. So it's a start.
Thank you for that. We have some great questions coming up in the Q&A we have a great set of educators in our audience tonight.
Awesome.
I hope everyone doesn't mind if I actually name the people that are attached to the question, because I think our furniture world is a very small community, and I think it's nice to connect. So this is
great. Thank you.
Absolutely. There are two questions actually related to values that I want to come back to that came up earlier, but just on the subject of education, I want to throw this in there. This is from Tom Lozier. Could you unpack or talk a bit about the kinds of things you are doing at Columbia College to change the framework and structure of the art and design education you are offering students, and how that may shift things in the future generation?
Sure. Well, at my school, we've been on this road for about 6 years. This is, for us, it's not a new trend because of George Floyd. It's something we've been doing for some time. So we started by doing training our faculty and staff. About 70% of our faculty and staff has been trained by the People's Institute anti-racist training group in New Orleans. And so we started there just to have a language around what does anti-racism look like, and what can an anti-racist institution look like? What are some of the levers and principles to get there? And we're continuing this. We're taking a second stage to this by bringing a more structural perspective into all areas of the institution, with continuing our training with a local group that's very similar called CROAR, that works with institutions structurally to try to get to the root system. So we are putting together an anti-racism team from all around our college, from administrators to students and staff. And I want to say, one of the missing pieces that I find in talking with some folks around the country is students. Students need to be involved in this. So again, it's taking those vertical structures and turning them horizontal. So not privileging the administrators to tell everybody what to do, but to bringing everybody to the table. And this new group will be working for the next 2 years to do an audit of our institution, to look at where do we need to focus, and to come up with a plan for how we can bring the anti-racism efforts that are kind of on the edges and the margins of our institution into the middle. So I can't say what that's going to look like. I don't know that many people have tried it that way, but we're going to try it that way and see what happens. I think what's unusual about our institution is we have support from the top to do this. We have a lot of people of color at the top of our administration that we don't have to convince how important this is. So I think that's a big hurdle that some other institutions have to work with.
It is an interesting time, isn't it? We're all trying to create solutions, and this is a new path. So
it is.
We kind of don't know where solutions will go.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Tom.
So there are two other questions. Again, I'll just ask them in order. One is from Chris Loomis, who teaches in our program. He says, is possession an either or thing? How can generosity replace possession, particularly when there is beauty involved?
Well, I think it goes down to some of the things I mentioned, kind of getting rid of control, of the impulse to control, the impulse of surveillance. Those systems are kind of really attached to colonialism, right? We see that when we look at the police and how they deal with Black communities in most places around the world. Look at what's happening. I haven't kept up with what's happening in Seattle and Minneapolis, and if they're still protesting, but I know that I think in Minneapolis, they backed away from defunding the police. So if you look at the police state, that comes directly from the slave state, right? The idea that someone has to show a card, 18th century Black person who was enslaved, if they went out in town, had to show an ID or a card from their owner that they had the right to be in that space. Is that much different from a young Black man walking down the street and the police asking them for their ID, like they might not belong where they're supposed to be? So I think you have to take those, generosity is like an antidote to some of those things, I think is what I'm saying. And that I don't see how you can have generosity in the space of violence. They're opposite things.
My eye just flicked over to the clock. We're just, unfortunately, 3 minutes from 7 o'clock. I'd like to, if everyone's okay with sticking around for a minute, I'd love to, we have one more question in the Q&A from Deirdre Visser. I love the Afrofuturist conception of the simultaneity of time scales. Is there anything we can learn about time from the experience of COVID?
Absolutely, that's a great question, Deirdre. I think that if you take COVID in the time of history and you look at other times when we've been in situations like this, that if we're smart, we won't make the same mistakes when we've had pandemics before, when we've had tragedies before. I think if we're smart, we'll try to think differently. I mean, and I gotta say, the best thing we can do, you're my friend if you vote. I mean, leadership is really key, but the way that we have this country structured, it's so vertical that one person gets to dominate where we're going. And I think that if we don't use the power that we have, and two of the main powers that we have in the system we're currently in is, one is our vote, and two is our purse. Where you spend your money makes a difference, right? You're supporting something. Be conscious. Like, I just found out a company that I used to get supplies from supported our current president. And I'm like, okay, that account's gone. It really makes a difference where you put your money, and you must use the power we have to try to make change, to get more enlightened leadership. So thank you, Deirdre, and that's my answer to your wonderful question.
Excellent, thank you, Fo. I'm trying to ask right now if we might be able to go a little bit over. I want to respect your time though, because you're on Chicago time. I know
it's okay. We can go. If you have, if people want to stay, I'll stay a bit.
Okay. There's another question in the Q&A. And I'm just going to read it here. Thank you for sharing your work, Fo. In my experience, design and craft classrooms are not very diverse. So how do you share ideas of radical making in ways that it can reach communities who need to experience art most?
I think my example of the MCA was a one to go out into the community. I think make the walls of the institutions of the academy much more porous and bring others in, but also go out. I know one thing I try to do as a professor is break the wall between the classroom teaching and teaching in the real world. Like, when I can, if I have a project where students can be engaged, I bring them in and engage with them and invite them to be part of my professional practice. I want them to know more what the world is about. But I think bringing the classroom to the world is one way to do that. But you know, you got to do the other thing too, is get more representation in the classrooms. That like in my institution, where our freshman class was about 59% of students that identify as color. That's huge, right? So if our faculty doesn't look something like them, they're going to be pretty disappointed. They either got to look like them or they got to be pretty woke, and they have to have a pretty progressive curriculum that they're teaching and know how to relate to a diverse group of students. So I think that's one thing that should be done as much as possible.
Great, thank you for that, Fo. Let's see, okay, the questions are coming in. A collector of design, this is from the chat, sorry, from the Q&A. As a collector of design and craft objects, how does one find works that represent racial making? Radical making, sorry, there was a little typo there.
Well, first I'd have to know how you define radical making.
My apologies to the attendee who typed that in. I missed a letter, it was radical making. Right. Let's see, does the person who asked that question want to articulate in the chat maybe a little bit? Which I think the chat's open to everyone right now if you want to chime in. Trying to like negotiate the Q&A and chat at the same time. So if the anonymous, if the person who asked that question would like to elaborate in the chat, we'll come back to that question. I'll jump over to another one right now. From E.G. Crichton. Fo, it's nice to see and hear you. I hope we can visit in person sometime before too long. I think that's a sentiment we all feel right now.
Yes.
And
hi, E.G. How are you?
this was so much more interesting than the presidential debate.
Oh, I'm so glad.
So many sentiments.
You didn't go for the fiasco. I don't even know if it started already. My sense of time is kind of not there.
I think that might be it for tonight. I appreciate your time, folks. Again, wonderful. I'm so excited for a time when we can actually have you here in person and we can have these discussions and see you in the shop and share a space with you again. So thank you for coming tonight. I put a bunch of links into the chat for everyone to check out Fo's latest projects, including BlkHaUS, the collaboration with Norman Teague. Thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you for coming, everyone.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Catherine and CCA, and thank you for everyone that attended. I'm sorry I can't see you and wave. I'm waving to you, but thank you for attending. Stay in touch.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for coming tonight.